Let's get started. What does the future look like for places we play, connect, relax, recharge, run, and share in Vancouver? What does it look like right now? And what could it look like in the future? That's the exciting part. Not very technically oriented. Was I supposed to play this next? Watch the video. If you've worked in recreation for 30 years, that hits you, man. I think technically I wasn't supposed to play that yet, but it's actually quite inspiring. And you know what? It really does kind of tell you that all of that is happening here. That's what's happening already. We already have amazing and engaged people and amazing facilities. We have the chance now to be world leaders in this and to take it even further. So the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation is developing Vancouver's playbook, a new plan to guide how we create vibrant parks and recreation over the next 25 years. This event tonight forms part of VanPlay. It's our year-long project of community engagement, data collection, mapping, analysis, problem solving, and discussions just like this one, which in the end will leave us with, wait for it, a playbook. Makes good sense. I don't know if I have any more slides left, so let's see where I'm at. I have no idea what that is. So, little note, go through the slides before you do this. So, tonight's topic, I believe we have a fantastic speaker coming up, but tonight's topic is community and vision. This evening, we will hear from one of seven fantastic speakers. And they're from our community, and they're going to share ideas, and they are provocative thought starters, and we hope that you are challenged and that you come through and that you shine as we expect you to. So thank you, and imagine now you're watching the video and now you're inspired. And at this point, I'm looking over to Catherine because I believe I'm going to invite up the first speaker. Come on up, Andrew.
Thank you.
I've set it up. You can do better than that.
Sometimes I don't even have any idea what that is either. Thank you. This is live. Yes. Is this on? Nope. I'll use this guy. Okay, and then, yeah? Okay. All right. It's working. Community and, no, it's okay, thanks Sam. Community and vision. Thank you so much. Thank you, Donnie, for the great introduction, and Park Board for the fantastic video. And a big thank you to the Urbanarium folks, to UBC Sala, to the Park Board staff and elected officials for all of the amazing work that you all do with respect to public space every single day of the year. It's a delight to be here this evening. My name is Andrew Pask. I'm the Executive Director of the Vancouver Public Space Network. Full disclosure, I'm also a city planner as well, but tonight I am wearing my volunteer public space advocate's hat. And I'm here to deliver an interesting talk, I hope, although one that is a bit congested because it's talking about a whole bunch of things around the future of public space. Under the banner, I would add, of community and vision, two of the most dangerously ambiguous words in the English language. So we'll see how far we get and how it all works out. My talk is on the future of public space. Parks, of course, being a type of public space, recreation being a component of public space as well. First thing to note, though, folks, is that the future is a rather difficult thing to get into and to talk about in any great way, with any great effect. It's a lot harder to predict the further out we go. It's sometimes difficult with the President and his Twitter account to predict what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. So let alone grounding ourselves in a sort of longer-term vision of the future, a bit of a challenge at times. We're going to do our best, though, and cast our minds ahead using some crystal balls, and then also, I think, looking at some of the trends that we've got going right now that help to guide things. But as a starting point, I think it's worth asking ourselves, as we look ahead 25 or 35 or 50 years, what was the conversation like 25 or 35 years ago? Because it gives you a sense of the nature of the unpredictability of things, stuff that might not have been on our radar. Did we, for example, talk about the Syrian refugee crisis? Did we talk about income polarization or affordability or homelessness? Did we talk about autonomous vehicles, which are going to have a humongous impact on our roads? The war on terror, social media, and of course, MAGA. Make America Great Again, Mr. Trump. Now, I know some of the astute amongst you who have longer memories will know, in fact, we actually were talking about Trump 25 years ago. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was Marla Maples that was the source of the discussion. And the even more astute amongst you may recognize that, in fact, we were also talking about autonomous vehicles back then as well, with turbo boost and such. But the point is that when we talk about the future and trying to predict these things, even the sort of known entities play out in different ways than we might expect. The future is a very intangible entity, a little bit like the painting of Ivo Panaghi's locomotive. The future is about speed, it is about motion, it is a little bit difficult to pin down, the edges are always blurry. So, what will public space be like in the future? I'm going to start, I think, by putting a few sort of very obvious statements out there, and none of this is going to be revelatory in any real way for folks. But I think it's worth sketching out some of the known entities right now, because they're really going to be part of the conversation as we move forward. Number one, we like boldness, and this is a room that I think is informed by a lot of folks in the design and creative communities. We are going to continue to have boldness in parks and plaza. The Highline effect, both good and bad, is going to continue to inform our discussion. These are the sites, like Markthal in Rotterdam and elsewhere, that captivate the attention, that make the rounds on social media, that generate excitement, that provide new sorts of convivial opportunities, new types of investment, and really part and parcel with public space design, speak to the renaissance of placemaking as it's unfolded over the last few years across the world and around our city as well. Here in Vancouver, this is going to infuse the conversations that we have about some of our local spaces as well, whether it's the Northeast Falls Creek Park that's coming online, a beautiful new park system that will help to stitch neighborhoods together, whether it's the park at Smythe and Richards, which is smaller but nonetheless extremely elegant. These are going to be our new destinations, our new shinier, bigger public spaces, if you will. And in some cases, they'll also be renewed destinations, like our 800 block of Robson Square, which is finally being turned into the plaza that it was originally envisioned by Arthur Erickson. So, point number one, the big stuff is still going to be there. It's still going to be part of the conversation. Point two, though, is that a lot of the spaces that we're going to be looking at, especially as the city grows and changes, are not going to be the parks and plazas that have traditionally been the focus of our gathering. There's going to be an awful lot of attention paid to streets as a typology of public space here. They account for about 30% of the landmass in the city. They provide an endless array of opportunities. If you haven't seen the Irby.com website, it is a global collection of before and after photos around how cities are transforming public spaces. In Vancouver, we have lots of opportunities in this regard. We've got Gastown and Water Street. We've got Commercial Drive, to name just two, where we're looking at that question of road diet, how to deal with the right-of-way, and to think about opportunities to more equitably allocate the space between property lines. Point number three, a lot of the public space conversation is going to involve grounded acts of reimagining underutilized spaces. In the same trajectory as I was just talking about with roads, there are also an array of other spaces that are going to come into play a lot more, with a lot more of a pronounced fashion, whether it's bridges, whether it is our array of underutilized corporate spaces downtown, which are really active during lunch, but tend not to be activated outside of that. However, just a little bit of programming, and we can start to get these spaces coming online and providing a whole bunch of opportunity for folks. Then there's laneways, which provide an array of opportunities as well. This is one of our projects from earlier this summer. A very simple one-day transformation of a laneway in Gastown shows the potential. Just a little bit of money. It only took probably a couple $1,000s to make this happen, but it had people flowing through it in great numbers all day long. Point four, some of the truly significant moves that we're going to be dealing with are going to be extremely small scale. You saw the ping pong table in the last photo there. Our friends Frida and Frank have been traveling around the city doing that. Beautiful intervention. The public pianos a few years ago that have been rolling out this year and last year as well, they speak to that type of very simple, very elegant intervention in space, more urban acupuncture, if you like, that really helps to catalyze these spaces. It's a type of tactical urbanism that really talks about possibility. And if we speak of public space offering an invitation to people, these sorts of things are the embossing on the invitation. Whether or not they're temporary or moved to permanent, the types of tiny interventions there, they provide delight, whimsy, play, and these sorts of things. Okay, another point on the list of obvious stuff. Technology is still going to shape our public space in a big sort of way. Smartphones have revolutionized things. We hashtag life right now. We talk about the Instagrammability of a public space. We roll out games that gather enormous numbers of people together. We augment reality. What's the next generation of augmented reality going to look like with these sorts of things here? Really key stuff. So let's move on quickly. There's health. We're going to have a factor that's key. The CMO is always a driver of placemaking in the city. We're going to have some very significant considerations around aging population, but also youth, children. All of these sorts of demographic drivers are really key. So, those are hardly earth-shaking predictions. I'm going to close, though, with a few things that I think are really key things to think about in this day and age. We've talked about population growth briefly. Population growth and the density that it brings also offers us some real opportunities around richer and more complex public spaces. But if you've ever tried to have a conversation about density with folks, you'll know that it's not always the most palatable of subjects, and in many respects it's treated as an anathema to life as we know it. More density will interrupt the social fabric of things. That's something that we collectively have to tackle. There is also some other fairly significant issues. Climate change. This is the King Tide event from a few years ago. Look at the sea level map that we have in the city. We know that False Creek is going to be especially hard hit. The preeminent seawall public space that we use as our main promenade is going to be underwater. How are we going to deal with these sorts of things? We have simple and effective storytelling around it, but we need more. Rain is another sort of area that we're going to need to look at there because the number of rain events are going to be increasing substantially in the city. We're going to probably have 10 times the number of dramatic rain events within just a few decades. So what are we going to do? How are we going to address public space design with that? We've got simple interventions, we've got more challenging interventions, we've got opportunities that present itself from around the world that show us different sorts of ways. So there is a whole array of things that we can get to here. There were a few topics that I didn't get a chance to talk to that I think some of my subsequent panelists are going to speak to. But with that, I'm going to bring it to a close. Thank you very much. Oh, look, you get the rest of the presentation now.
Hi, my name is Emily Sider, and I'm a recent graduate of UBC's School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And this is a project that I developed as my thesis toward my master's in architecture. Oh, is this better? Okay. The inevitability of a catastrophic earthquake striking Vancouver lingers at the edge of the public imagination. Everyone knows about the big one, but the uncertainty of it will hit, but the uncertainty of when it will hit and the overwhelming scale of the impending destruction makes it challenging to prepare. By studying the recovery from earthquakes that have recently affected modern urban centers around the world, we're learning how important public open spaces are after a disaster. Through a series of seen and hidden and before and after illustrations, this project explores how the development of Vancouver's parks might be leveraged to foster a culture of preparedness before an earthquake and increase neighborhood-scale resilience after a disaster. As we were gently reminded in December 2 years ago, Vancouver is located in an active seismic region. The tectonic forces responsible for building our beloved mountains also have the potential to generate catastrophic earthquakes. There have been many large earthquakes in British Columbia's history, but only recently has there been a population density for one to cause massive damage. On average, seismologists observe over 2,500 earthquakes in BC every year. Most are too small or too remote to be felt, but the worst-case scenario magnitude has not recurred here since 1700, when a magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami devastated First Nations communities along the coast. The recurrence interval of these large events varies by hundreds of years, given the geologic timescale. Even though we know we are at risk, it's difficult to find funding and political will to prepare for such an uncertainty. Much of this region's buildings and critical infrastructure are vulnerable to earthquake damage. An area's seismic risk is largely dependent on its underlying geology. Stable bedrock and older, well-consolidated sediments underlie much of Vancouver and the North Shore, including the hill we are on or under here. Neighboring low-lying areas, however, consist of unconsolidated alluvial sediments, which were deposited by the Fraser River after the last ice age. This loose, water-saturated ground is hazardous because it can amplify seismic waves and is prone to liquefaction. These liquefiable zones are home to major transportation infrastructure. A large earthquake could cripple the region's air and seaports, bridges, and tunnels, isolating the lower mainland and complicating relief efforts. The government recommends people be prepared to be cut off for 3 days, but it could easily be longer. Vancouver's underground infrastructure, such as water and sewer lines, could also be damaged. Vancouver's water supply is especially vulnerable, with reservoirs on the North Shore connected by pipes that run under English Bay. Anticipating widespread failure and limited capacity for repairs, city officials warn that it could take many months to bring these systems back to full capacity. Even though it is a relatively young city, Vancouver's building stock is also vulnerable. A predicted 90,000 or more people in Metro Vancouver could be displaced. This means a population equal to that of the entire downtown peninsula could be homeless and require emergency shelter following an earthquake. The City of Vancouver is working to develop a more robust relief measure in the event of a disaster, but the government's response plan depends on neighborhoods to act autonomously. As part of this strategy, Vancouver has designated its 25 community centers as disaster support hubs, familiar places where people can go to get information and aid in the event of a crisis. Already coupled with parks and open playing fields that would be clear of rubble, these hubs are well suited to host temporary facilities such as cots, water tanks, portable showers, and toilets. Unfortunately, these facilities are not yet purpose-built. They're also widely dispersed throughout the city and could be quickly overwhelmed. The hubs are a good starting point, though. They are already positioned in the community to serve as centers of organization and act as the link between top-down relief efforts and grassroots neighborhood-scale organization. This project imagines how this network of hubs might be developed in a way that enhances the quality of everyday life in the city while holding the latent capacity to act as essential life support in the event of an earthquake. This proposal is a scalable and distributed response, focused around the need for public access to water, both before and after a disaster. It starts by tapping into the system of greenways that the city is developing under its green initiatives. This network of bike and walking paths is already designed to tie together the city's major public spaces, including parks and community centers. A series of water storage tanks and drinking fountain stations are proposed along the greenways as they are constructed throughout the city. Before an earthquake, these water stations would serve as an amenity that makes the bike lanes more user-friendly. After disaster, if people can access their own water off the grid for drinking, cooking, and hygiene, it would take a huge burden off emergency responders. Similarly, as Vancouver's parks undergo improvement projects over time, how could they also be redesigned to enhance day-to-day city livability while also holding the latent capacity to serve as neighborhood-scale nodes of aid, densifying this network of disaster relief hubs? For this project, Nelson Park serves as a test site for a neighborhood node. It sits along the developing Comox-Helmken Greenway and fills a gap in the broader network of hubs. As one of the few large open spaces in the dense and vulnerable West End neighborhood, this park is a likely location for residents to seek refuge and support. The park is reconceived as a varied and playful terrain. Water storage tanks are distributed under expressive mounds of grass at the main entrances, where they are easily accessible to people using the bike path. Manual pumps are meant to bring an awareness to the water source before an earthquake and allow people to access water even if the cisterns are cut off from the grid. A public washroom pavilion serves as the armature for cached equipment needed by first responders and can unfold into a local command center. The edge of the park along the greenway is broadened into a wide promenade. On normal weekends, it hosts the farmers market, but could serve as a dock for mobile disaster relief equipment, such as washrooms and field kitchens. The stepped plaza to the south corner is a wading pool fountain in the summer months and can be drained to host events. It is also a large enough pad for a helicopter to land or to sling in heavy equipment. A viewing tower provides a privileged vantage of the neighborhood to the public and can act as a lookout and communication tower in an emergency. Community garden beds engage residents with the care of the park, strengthening critical social networks. Unprogrammed play and leisure space of gardens, lawns, and groves of trees allow people to get lost in greenery, offer refuge from the city in normal life, or a momentary sense of normalcy while recovering from a disaster. While the capacity of one park is not enough to support the entire city or even a whole neighborhood, after an earthquake, this strategy of distributed, latent infrastructure is scalable. Something is better than nothing, and the more the better. With no collective memory of previous disasters, the presence of these nodes as markers of future risk is also an opportunity for education and increased awareness, which might foster a culture of preparedness thinking throughout the community. Thank you.
Hi there. That works. My name is Ildi, and I'm Child and Youth Friendly Communities Coordinator for the Society of Children and Youth BC. I'm also a doctoral student at the UBC's Faculty of Education. My work and research can be situated at the intersection of urban planning, sustainability education, and community development. And today I'll present a vision for Vancouver's parks and public space, one of children's participation, of integrating young people's voices into decision-making. It's a vision rooted in environmental sustainability, social equity, and human rights discourse. But I'd like to start off with a short little activity. So I ask all of you to sit back and close your eyes. Take yourself back in time to when you were a school-age child, somewhere between the age of 7 and 12. And think of a most fun and favorite activity of yours at this age, one you have really great memories of. Remember where it was and who was there with you. Now, open your eyes, and with a show of hands, I'd like to see how many of you remembered an outdoor setting. Awesome. And how many remembered one in nature? Still quite a few. I'm also wondering, were there, how many of you were there without a grown-up? Yeah. The good old days, right? So as we know, a lot has changed for children over the past 30 years. Childhoods are more urban, and with density, we often lose green space, and there's increased traffic congestion. Children are much more sedentary. That's not working. It is working. Sorry. Behind with my slides. Much more sedentary. Access to nature in Vancouver may be exceptionally good, yet outdoor, self-directed, and passively supervised free play is decreasing. While we used to walk or bike to school from a young age, today children are mostly driven around. As young people are more and more relegated to children's spaces, they are in fact becoming excluded and displaced from the public realm. Alongside all these changes, we see children's physical and mental health deteriorating. Obesity, diabetes, anxiety are on the rise. Many children today not only lack the skills and core muscle to climb a tree, but also lack the self-confidence and intrinsic motivation to do so. Levels of childhood depression and apathy are rising, and children report feeling less and less connected to others in their community. But how do we turn this tide? How do we create a city where children feel they belong, where they're included and welcome rather than excluded, displaced, and disconnected? So what I'd like to present here is a model of participatory planning with children that I believe can initiate this shift and promote a culture of participation. So there are great examples of this model around the world, including Finland and Netherlands, for example. But today I'll be talking about a place a bit closer. It's the city of Boulder, Colorado, where I had the opportunity to spend a term as a planning intern a couple of years ago. The Growing Up Boulder initiative, similar to the Child and Youth Friendly Cities work of our organization, follows a rights-based focus of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and especially the right for children to participate in decisions that affect their lives. This is brought together with the participatory approaches of growing up in cities. Growing Up Boulder's goal is to include young people in design and planning of sustainable child-friendly spaces, and to empower young people with opportunities for inclusion, and to have young people participate in deliberation on local issues that affect their lives. The initiative began in 2009 as a partnership between the city's Department of Planning and Sustainability, the Boulder Valley School District, and the University of Colorado's Center for Child and Youth Engagement. And the partnership has since grown to include multiple departments at the city, including Parks and Recreation, Transportation, and Housing. And over the years, the work has extended to engage groups of children, youth, and families, undergraduate students, in after-school programs, in schools, in various other community-based settings. Some projects take 20 or more sessions, others are built into classroom curriculum. Teachers can expand the work based on a class's educational goals. Other projects may be shorter term and delivered in the community. These participatory projects promote dialogue and collaboration between young people, decision makers in local government, and experts in sustainability planning and design. They ensure that young people have a say in the city's planning initiatives. Growing Up Boulder also aims to deliver programs that can amplify the voice of low-income and ethnically diverse groups of young people. Methods of engagement include community assessments through photo voice, photo grids, mapping with a method called included BioBlitz, model building, deciduous play method, and community workshops and presentations, just to list a few. The process of engagement begins with establishing children as experts. This is achieved through the use of methods that allow creative expression, art, drawing, photography, and play. Projects look at a familiar content, such as a favorite place, and this is the starting point for discussion. Next, the knowledge is deepened through forms of place-based experiential education that includes field trips and interaction with community members, experts, as well as peers. And finally, ideas are synthesized in the form of models, for example, and are presented and discussed with community members and city leaders. Growing Up Older also makes sure that this is a two-way dialogue and students get to hear back from the city about where and how their input influenced decisions. The example here is the outcome of a visioning for a walk bike summit, which was held as part of a transportation master plan update. In the next bit, I will run through some quick highlights of one case of parks and public space planning in Boulder. This was the redevelopment of the Boulder Civic Area, which is a central public space and municipal park just south of Boulder's downtown. The redesign process had two phases and began with the development of a vision, and then moved into site planning 2 years later. Over 150 young people were engaged from preschool age till high school. Methods included photo voice and photo grids, model making, renderings, city-esque play, field trips, and presentations and dialogue with the city. The photo grid method here allows for a systematic visual documentation of an area. Both photo voice and photo grids ask students to highlight the attributes of an area that they like and would like to keep, as well as the ones they believe that should be changed. Growing Up Boulder also piloted the city-esque play method during this project. This is a design activity inspired by urban planner James Rojas, where everyday found objects are used in model building to generate innovative design ideas. Students also conducted family interviews to learn about great public spaces from many parts of the world. The final part of the visioning phase was a design competition held by the city. Students were invited to vote, and their top choices matched those of the city. During the second phase of site planning, new groups of students were engaged, and various new methods were also introduced, including the nicho boxes, which are mixed media boxes that traditionally combine elements from Roman Catholicism, mestizo spirituality, and popular culture to express something culturally and personally meaningful. Students also worked with an artist and created clay sculptures. Both these methods provided creative ways for children to share ideas for interactive and public art. With over 35 engagement projects in transportation, housing, sustainable design, and parks planning, all who took part learned many lessons, both about children's needs in their communities and also about how young people and all people benefit from the process. One major lesson was that play and nature are top priorities in children's lives. What children prefer, though, are biodiverse, wild places, ones where they not only look at, but have the opportunity to physically interact with nature, to get in the water, climb on those rocks and trees, rough and tumble in the wilderness. The projects help adults recognize that children have valuable knowledge and insights. In numerous projects, young people highlighted the need to design spaces that are inclusive of all community members, including children, teens, elderly, transient populations, and animals. And they also asked that spaces not separate children or teens' activities from other groups, but integrate them. Participatory projects of this type reconnect children to place. And students also gain knowledge and skills in sustainability issues and active citizenship. They learn their input is of value and the government can listen. Through collaborative work, they develop better relationships. The projects also benefit the entire community, building relationships, promoting social and environmental stewardship. In conclusion, I would like to say that I wish to see this inspiring model of participatory planning with children adopted in Vancouver. I believe Vancouver can take up a leading role and create a city where children and youth are part of our public sphere. and not relegated to their homes and institutions at all times, but where they can play and move around freely and safely within a supporting and caring community. I wish to see this city continue to increase access to nature, making sure there are not only green but wild green places to play and connect with in nature within 5 minutes of every child's home. And I wish to see a commitment in practice within local governments to include all citizens, whatever their age, in dialogue and decision-making when planning our communities. In fact, I'd say we have already started. At the Society of Children and Youth, we're currently developing a series of school-based engagements and working together with several departments at the city. We will begin piloting, but I need to end here and thank everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the great support I have received from my supervisor, Luis Chala, and mentors Tori Darren Marminster in Boulder, Colorado. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessie, and I'm a youth worker and a advocate for children. So I work with the front line with youth, and my main passion is youth with disability. I'm sorry I don't have a video for you I wanted to show, but I just wanted to share from my heart about what I do and what I see with the vision with Vancouver will be within our communities. So I'll give you a brief past of what I've been doing since I'm really nervous. I don't speak in front of a lot of people all the time. And usually it's with kids and they kind of look at me. It's like, what? And they're just waiting for the pizza and the candy and the pop to hang out. Sorry, I don't have that. So growing up, I got into working with youth with disabilities when I was actually in elementary school in Victoria on the island, and I worked with a group with Victor Street Gym. And from there, I was doing, funny enough, one-on-one support work at the age of 10. And then I went into Operation Track Shoe, which is kind of a next step to the Special Olympics program with Victoria. And there was a great program that this project was going in, and a few years later it died down shortly. Since then, I actually work part-time at Starbucks. And what we do at Starbucks is we actually opened our youth program to youth with disabilities, and we allow to train and set programs in the store and in the coffee shops to give them the experience and frontline work within our communities. And part of the other project I'm working on is with TLC. It's a youth with disability after school program. And when I first started there last year, it was in Kitts Community Center. It was situated downstairs and in this big, beautiful room, but windows, lights, but it didn't have a lot of color. So that was one thing that I noticed as working with youth. They are drawn to color, to nature, and I want to thank Ildi for really setting me up, because this is really important for our youth today, especially youth with disabilities, to have a voice in the community. So I operate a little bit differently. I actually allow my youth to run and create programs. So the youth will sit there with a calendar, and I ask them, what would you like to do? What are things that you don't get an opportunity to do outside of home and school? And, for the summer, they asked that they wanted to go hiking, and they wanted cooking programs. They wanted to go out more in the community and engage with other people. They wanted to learn how to play sports. So I wanted to create programs for them that they wanted to do, not how I wanted them to do it. So basically what I did is I created the program, And we ended up getting a sponsorship with Grouse Mountain. We ended up going hiking with them, and for some of them, money is a barrier. Going up there, the barriers is cost. So I try to find ways to alleviate that, and try to find funding and grants and all that to support these youth who come from situations. They're vulnerable, they're at risk, but they also live in the poverty. And I want to be able to provide all the things that I'm able to do that they're not, so we can be able to build this community. So basically what we want to do is support the inclusion and diversity and empowerment of a well-being with people with disabilities and autism. I want to be able to run programs and educate and services in our communities to be more inclusive to all. And we want them to be able to feel very independent, but along with that comes a stigma. And yesterday I had a parent who came into my my program, and she came in, she was very apprehensive, and she looked at me and she started to cry. And I said, "Is everything okay?" And she said, "No, I don't know if she's going to like this. I don't know if she's going to be supported, and I'm worried about the stigma and all the things that are tied with it." And she was actually facing me, and I was facing back of her daughter, and she didn't see what her daughter was doing. And this is a child who has autism and anxiety issues. And she was really nervous about coming, but she came. As I was watching her, she was actually playing cards, she was eating, she was laughing, and she was actually telling the boys what to do and how to play the games. And I had her mother look around, had her mother turn around and look and see what her daughter was capable of doing. And she just basically was just like, started crying and said, "Thank you so much," to making my daughter feel very inclusive. And I said, that's the whole point, is to make these programs inclusive and then take it to the next step and take these programs that are silo and include them into regular programming. That's one of my big things, is that we tend to create programs for children with disability and autism, and we don't include them into like the regular day-to-day regular programming. And that was one thing that I really am trying to push for, and finally it happened this year. So this summer we went along with a group of 200 people, kids, for summer camp, and they were part of it. And a lot of them were nervous because, like, well, we've never been part of this. Like, I said, it's just like going to school. You're with your friends from school, but we're doing it in summer. And they made more friends during that summer, and it was amazing. It was, when we opened those doors and those possibilities for youth with disabilities to be in our community, that's basically what I want to see. I want to be able to see our parks be able to have access for wheelchairs down to the swimming pool. I want to be able to see a child who is in a wheelchair to swing on a playground or go down a slide. I want to see those possibilities to be the no possibilities, like they can do it. And, and I'm advocating and I'm being their voice, and this is why I'm not the one that should be up here. It should be those youth today, telling you guys that this is what we want to see, and they are smart and they are brilliant and they are just the most amazing children and youth I've ever worked with. They've made a huge difference in my life, and that is why I'm being their voice for them. One quote that really stood out for me was from Dr. Temple Grandin. "There needs to be a lot more emphasis on what a child can do instead of what he or she cannot do." So I want to be able to take that and tell the City of Vancouver and the parks and see that vision of these children and these youth, as Ilda was saying. We need to hear what they have to say. So I'm hoping one day that my youth from my program can come up here and share what they would like to see. because I'm only speaking on behalf of them. And when you work with kids on the front line and you start seeing what the possibilities and capabilities are, they're the ones that are going to transform the city. They're the ones that are going to be able to vision for the next 25 years. And that's really what I want to see, is to get their voices out there and for them to be heard and them to be seen, and to be seen as a person and not a person with disability or a person with autism. And, you know, I'm pretty sure you guys look, I mean, I have a learning disability, and you don't see it, but I have it. And, you know, there's a difference of not seeing it and seeing it, and we need to remove that stigma. And so for that, I really want to thank VanPlay for allowing me to speak here wholeheartedly on behalf of my youth, especially the ones that are at risk and are vulnerable. They're the ones that tend to get missed out, and I'm really pleased that the vision and the voice of these youth will be heard for today, for tomorrow, and our future. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Rawlick, and I work for the Stanley Park Ecology Society. And I'm the school programs manager with the Stanley Park Ecology Society. I'm lucky. I get to go out into the field every single day with kids and play with them. And in a year, I get to see about 6,000 students through the park. So I'd like to share a few sort of concepts that I take to heart when I run my programs. And hopefully they'll enlighten potentially other parks. So this photo is actually from 1908, and I just wanted to start with this concept that people have been playing in our natural areas for longer than this has been a city, longer than there's been designated parks. And even once there was, people loved parks. They loved playing in them. And so this idea of bringing in VanPlay into the conversation is a great one. It's what people do in our parks. This is a photo of Stanley Park when there was a zoo in Stanley Park. Some of you may have remembered that time. In fact, my organization back in the day used to be called the Stanley Park Zoological Society, and we were focused on education and conservation within the zoo. Obviously, things have changed over time. This is my next point that I want to bring up. Our values, our societal values, really do shape how we interact and play in parks. And that has to be taken into consideration. Some things that were okay and actually everybody loved are now closed or no longer around. So things change. So if we're going to be talking about play, I think that it's important that we all ask ourselves what it means to play and what it actually looks like. Because it in itself is a fairly vague, broad category. This is also from Stanley Park. This is from a book that is from 1925. If you can't read any of the words in the photo, that's a lawn bowling area. And it's still in Stanley Park. And this is a form of planning, park planning, that creates structured play areas. And I would say that that's a fairly traditional model of working in park space. And it's an interesting one. I'm just curious, show of hands, who's ever done lawn bowling? Nice. Okay, so I would say that's about 10% of the room. And that's actually a fairly large footprint within Stanley Park or within a park. And so if we're considering the uses of a park and we're considering it in the framework of play, it's important to have places where a diversity of people play instead of just a small minority. It's still great to have things like this, don't get me wrong. But if we're moving forward to the future, I think it's important that we have that diversity so that everybody is using public space. It shouldn't just be for a small percentage. So this is also Stanley Park. You'll notice a trend. This one here is actually from last year. And I think that there's sometimes places that you wouldn't consider to be play areas that exist, and Stanley Park is full of them. I play there again all the time. So sometimes they're unexpected, unconventional, and sometimes novel play areas. If that's the case, we have to consider planning for these unconventional areas, that it's not always those traditionally structured areas. My main point that I want to get across is that really diverse places allow for a diversity of play. And this spot, I just want to go explore. There's so many things there that I could play with. And actually, what I notice is that all age groups can play in an area like this. Whether you're a birder who wakes up super early, or you're a kid coming to one of our programs, or you're walking along on these trails with some people that are vacationing here. Many, many groups play in these areas. So let's just play with nature in mind. Let's make sure that nature is at the core of this concept and is part of our framework at least. I think that it's fairly easy for us to think of play in the, again, traditional senses, let's say sports. But if nature is missed in that, then there's a whole gap in our understanding of what play can be. And sometimes when we focus on one particular thing, I think about it in education all the time. Sometimes there's this concept of null curriculum, or the things that are actually not hit or not talked about when you focus hard on one particular thing. So let's make sure that nature is not one of those things that becomes part of our null curriculum. I'm going to give you a few examples of how nature is actually helpful for play. And the first one is this tree that you may have seen just outside of Stanley Park. And it's actually called the catalpa tree. And it blew down in the 2006 windstorm. Now at the time, it was fairly common practice to remove debris, large woody debris specifically, from an area, chop it down, and turn it into something else. But there were some planners who thought that it was a good idea to keep this tree here, and I'm so grateful that they did. Every day when I bike to work, I see people playing on that, whatever age group they are. And again, this crosses not only our local groups, but also on a larger global scale. Tourists every day are hanging out on this. And you'll notice that it's at the perfect height for climbing, which is fairly rare within our parks too. So it actually is this example of how a structure can bridge language divides, bridge cultural divides, and bring people together. If there was this conference that happened last spring, called the Children and Nature Network Conference. And one of the greatest examples of play in parks was this. There was a group that this is how they create playgrounds, and it's natural playgrounds. They take dirt, they take water, they take twigs, branches, whatnot, and they pile them all together and then let people interact with it. And that's, I think, something missing from a lot of our parks. It's hard to interact with just grass. But it's fairly easy to interact with something like this. Every single day, the structures changed, they morphed, and I saw kids, I saw students, and I saw adults all playing together in these playscapes. So bringing nature into areas that may currently just be grass, even if it means just bringing in some twigs and dirt, is a pretty helpful way to increase the viability of play within them. This is taken from one of our day camps, and I think it's important too. If we are going to work with nature and play, maybe we should consider playing with nature and not separate from nature, and that it should really be incorporated with us. And yeah, I think that there's many things that can happen in parks. Some of them may injure or damage nature. And so if we have this as a principle that we want to have diverse spaces that allow for nature and they allow for a variety of people to work with them, let's make sure that we learn how to play within nature. When you do so, you learn to respect each other and the world around you. Sometimes it's hard to actually plan for all the things that people are going to play with. So this is some kids who are checking out some little aquatic bugs that are inside Beaver Lake. And I do this with students about 60 times a year. And it's pretty cool to see how that stuff changes. And I get excited about it every single time. But the kids do too, every single one of them. And it would be hard to imagine when you're planning a lake that this is going to be how it could be used. So if we're creating diverse spaces, potentially we might not know all the diverse uses of them either. And I think we have to accept that. We have to accept not knowing all the uses in which people are going to play. And it might actually be a beautiful thing, instead of just focusing and narrowing it down to a particular. Play is really good at creating exploration and empowering exploration and independence. And there's actually a few different ways that they do that. There's a lot of research that's been done on that. There's places in the world in Asia that do something called forest bathing. And it's just a powerful thing all around. Everybody knows it. And you might know it from your own personal experiences. So if we're going to be thinking about play and we're thinking about recreation, let's think about the root of these words, especially recreation, and see that it's connected to the same word, recreate. I think that it's time that we recreate our places so that we can plan for the unexpected. Thank you.
My name is Tara Moreau. Rena's joining us, so I'm going to jump ahead. Thank you very much for the opportunity to all the collaborators here tonight. It's really exciting to talk to you about what we've been doing at the UBC Botanical Garden. And before I get into our vision and what we're working on, my thing that brings me to this work every day is biodiversity. And I admitted I went to an environmental kids camp where I was spending time outdoors and learning about ecology from those ripe ages of 7 till 12. And that has shaped all of my understanding about personal relations, connections to nature. And what we're doing at the Botanical Garden is really trying to understand biodiversity, but in the larger context. And that's my goal today, is to how do we frame the future of VanPlay in a global context. And when we think of, if you take a map of where plants are going extinct, globally 1 in 5 species face extinction. If you take a map of where plants are going extinct and you overlay that with where languages, indigenous languages, are going extinct, we see that those are in the same places. And so as a botanical garden with botanists, and as we're doing our work, we have to understand that protecting biodiversity also means protecting it and engaging with culture. So biocultural diversity and bringing these plants and people together. Last year, the UBC Botanical Garden turned 100 years old, and my background is in agriculture and climate change. So spending much of my looking to the future and looking to the past was really amazing for me to learn about the history of a botanical garden, the history of people who gave their lives to wanting to protect plants and watersheds. And so I think as we look forward, we always have to learn back. Let's not make the same mistakes over and over again. And so how do we advance climate change solutions? What are the solutions? You know, we have, Dylan was showing us historic pictures of Stanley Park, and this is a historic picture of UBC campus, all clear cut, you know, and how do we imagine, this system has changed a lot. UBC looks a lot different today, and it will in the next 100 years. We're going to play in these two zones. We're going to look at current, today, sea level rise, and we heard about some of this. And this is what's really concerning to me. So 2100, we see False Creek Flats is covered in water. That's where our food bank's going to be and our hospital's going to be. And so how do we imagine and anticipate climate change and the impacts that are happening? And I'll just go back. Again, this is on the City of Vancouver's website. You can go, there's a really cool feature. You can move your little lever across and you see these models. Science has been telling us that climate change is happening and data can help us prepare for this. So the IPCC, show of hands of people who know what the IPCC is. So it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they work at a global level to how do we bring forward solutions. The two big buckets that they talk about is mitigation and adaptation. And so this is what my work is. How do we mitigate, which is reducing the impacts of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, but more importantly, how do we adapt? So for me, this is resilience, and this goes back to biodiversity, and how do we bring forward resilient ecosystems, communities, and ultimately a resilient planet to expected and unexpected impacts of climate change. And so how do we, at times the principles and the qualities of resilience actually are very difficult to plan for. How do we bring in all of these elements so that we can create resilient parks and a resilient city? So my goal and my dream is that we have a joined up policy. In food, my background, I do a lot of work with the Vancouver Food Policy Council, and we always talk about joined up food policy. But I would challenge us to have joined up global policy. So any plans that I'm designing at the UBC Botanical Garden, I'm trying to create partnerships and align them to international goals. And so we have to do this if we live in one ecosystem. And so how do we make sure that the indicators that Dylan is measuring are the same as the ones that I'm measuring so that we can measure our collective impact? So this is where my big bent this summer has been, how do we ground everything that we do in the Sustainable Development Goals? Can I get a show of hands of people who are somewhat familiar with these goals? And my hope is that we all walk away with an understanding that these SDGs will take us to 2030. So the United Nations have put these together. This is the global agenda for sustainable development. There's amazing goals and targets in here. And, you know, if we as a society and if Vancouver can, in its parts and spaces, create and align to these goals, then we can truly be the greenest city. So at the UBC Botanical Garden, I'm going to do a show of hands again. Who's been to the UBC Botanical Garden, say, this summer? Okay. Oh, I see you back there, Commissioner Weave. So I appreciate you guys all coming, and I'm going to hope that you come back again. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what we're doing and what our mission and our mandate is. And really, I have an awesome job. I get to work at this beautiful place, and we get to combine research and conservation and outreach and education and engage people in connecting to nature. So a program that I run really specifically targets adults and team building. How do we bring out teams to the UBC Botanical Garden for them to get to know one another, have fun in nature? So they get to play on the canopy walkway, they get to go in our food garden and eat fresh flowers. So it's targeting adults and teams, and my goal is how do we create a green economy? And part of that is this team building. So we have a canopy walkway, which is amazing, and people get up there, and there's this sense of arousal, and education changes when people are aroused in nature. I don't know totally how, but this is some of the work that we're trying to do, and collaborating with Dr. Jiaying Xiao in psychology, and she is a specialist in sustainable behavior change. And so we're working, and this is a grad student, Ivana, who's been working with me on her PhD, and measuring and quantifying the impacts of our educational programs on sustainable knowledge, willingness to act, and ultimately we're trying to understand behavior. Can a 3-hour tour at the Botanical Garden actually inspire people to be more sustainable? We hope so, and our indicators from our research is showing that indeed it can. This is a huge piece. How do you have children come and play in nature? And Dylan beat me. He had 6,000 kids come through his tours. We had about 5,000 last year on our guided tours. It's good competition to have, right? How do we challenge each other to bring in more people to our spaces? How many people go and use parks? I'm a big stickler for measuring, because we can't manage what we don't measure. So anyone been to our Apple Festival? It's coming up the second weekend after, it's the weekend after Thanksgiving. And this is a really interesting event, volunteer run. And our goal, this was started 26 years ago by volunteers who wanted to increase the people's knowledge of the diversity of apples grown in BC. So this year we will sell over 35,000 pounds of apples featuring 65 varieties of apples, which is pretty amazing. And it speaks to our mandate, so we're trying to have fun, but we're also trying to raise awareness about biodiversity and the difference that even within a species of apple, you can have a huge spectrum of biodiversity. Volunteer engagement, and I know, and for parks, I think this is a really important thing for us to think about. How do we engage people? People have time to give back to their community, and people want to give back to their community, but unfortunately, it takes time and resources to manage volunteers. A big piece that we've been working on, this is a complicated process and a poster, but a big piece, this speaks to this process that we've been going through at the Garden, where we did a large-scale interpretive signage project. And we put 65 interpretive signs in the Garden. We worked with Cygnus, which is a local design company, to create an experience for visitors who come to the Garden who don't want to tour, but just to explore the space. I invite you to come back, because I definitely believe that this has transformed our Garden. And you can see people will say, nobody reads signs, but actually people read signs, they're reading them. And every day we say to our colleagues, oh my God, they're reading them, you know? And it's really incredible as a way to activate the space that is inclusive. It's not in different languages, and that's our challenge, right? So one of my goals is, how do we translate these signs and make them inclusive to other communities and cultures? There's a lot of policies that need to be connected, and this goes back to joining up and how do we connect all of these policies ultimately within the city into the Sustainable Development Goals. We've been working in partnership with Metro Vancouver, so how does the city take a regional approach to this play? And so there's an online resource that you can go and see garden designs, but again, I challenge the city of Vancouver and this plan to really place what we're doing in the context of the region and the resources that we have within this region. Again, training. So we want to create this green economy. The UN is all talking about green economy, but we need to train up people in skills. We're losing farmers. We're losing people who are trained in horticulture. And lastly, I want to feature this in my colleague Douglas Justice, who's amazing, and he is the tree expert, and he focuses on maple trees, and we're celebrating maples this year. It's the 150th plus anniversary of Canada, so we have an amazing maple collection. But what we're trying to do is always support developing countries as well. So this is work that we do in Vietnam, and how do we share this knowledge? We heard earlier that we want Vancouver to be a leader, and I think it's about creating a great place for us to plan, but also disseminate this work to the broader community. So thank you very much.
Good evening. As you can see, my name is Rena Sutar. I work for the Vancouver Park Board. My Haida name is John Dutt, and I do go by both names. And I wanted to introduce myself a little bit, partly for my work at the Park Board, but partly because, and the reason that I introduce myself with my Haida name is to let you know the perspective that I come from, but also to put some parameters around that perspective. I am not Musqueam, Squamish, or Tsleil-Waututh. I'm grateful to be on their territories. But those are certain parameters. So the perspective that I come from is both Indigenous and not Indigenous. I was born and raised in Vancouver myself. So I thought I'd begin because I was approached by Catherine Howard to talk a little bit about VanPlay and our plans to look ahead 25 years and see what Parks and Recreation can do, to see what's already being provided to our city, and also to try to face some of the challenges that we've had in the past. So I actually just did a quick Google image search, and I just did Park Vancouver, and this was the first image that came up, and I actually thought it was a pretty good one because it's pretty indicative of what we're dealing with. It's got some natural space, it's got some naturalized space, it's got some cultural markers, it's got some sort of modern takes with the Corten steel, it's got the city in the background. This is a space that a lot of people would use. It's also a space that speaks a lot about culture. Nothing that you see in here, grasses included, is devoid of culture. Someone chose to put those there, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I think this image tells us a little bit about a lot of our values. We talk a lot about inclusion, accessibility, reconciliation. We would like to think that we're always aiming to ecologically conscious decisions, and we want to be family focused, and we would like to think that we are a cultural city. And I'm here to unpack some of those terms. First of which is inclusion. And I chose this image because it is an actually inclusive space. It has nothing built on it, and it says a little bit about the space in the background that was very much built, and it was built for particular people in mind. So looking at what we're trying to plan, a 25-year plan for meeting the recreation and parks needs for our city, I think we have to look at how to make it serve Indigenous peoples, or anyone else for that matter. And when we're talking about inclusion, what does that mean? What does inclusion look like in a park space? What does inclusion look like in community centers? Is it acceptance or representation or welcome? What about accessibility? One thing that we don't talk much about is the fact that people aren't feeling welcome already. That's why we have this question to begin with. And we like to say that our public spaces welcome everyone, but for some reason they don't. And we have to question why that is. The other challenge around accessibility is, where are these people? How do we go to them? How do we access them? The people in this room have all opted in to this discussion. But what about the people who are not already included, and how do we reach them? Why aren't people feeling welcome? And I invite you to consider that there is no such thing as a culturally neutral space. Everything that we have in this city has been cultivated, built, or chosen by somebody. Everything that a human being has touched is a cultural expression of their culture. So I also invite you to consider something like Stanley Park, which I know we all would like to think is a jewel of Vancouver, and it is a beautiful asset to this city. It also has a lot of history, which people have varying understandings of. But one thing to consider is that that place has had villages in it for thousands of years. And we think about Stanley Park as this wild, natural space where we can go and experience nature, as if, first of all, that we're separate from it, and second of all, that we can go into it and somehow absorb this wildness. It has been inhabited for 5,000 years. I would argue that Stanley Park is actually probably one of the most cultivated places in the entire Lower Mainland. That place is littered with berries. That place was selected and stewarded for thousands of years by people. That is not a culturally neutral space. We also talk a lot about reconciliation, and for my purposes, I'm actually going to back up a little bit, because reconciliation is something that we've talked a lot about internally and through our First Nations engagement process. And we've actually heard from a lot of people that reconciliation isn't really a goal that we're ready to meet, that reconciliation is really challenging because there's a lot of healing to do before we can kind of kiss and make up. So reconciliation for my purposes in my job, I'm taking that to mean reconciliation like the accounting term. Like we have one version of history and another version of history, and those are two sides of a ledger, and we have to bring those to equal. And that means pulling all of the relevant information to bear. So reconciliation, as it applies to, say, a 25-year master plan for parks and recreation, we have to start thinking about the facilities, whether or not they're inclusive. We have to think about the programming. We have to think about our spaces. And there are several approaches to do this. The first one is usually to say, okay, how do we get these people in? How do we bring them into our space? And as I've mentioned, that's not actually necessarily a wise way to go about things. They're not coming into our space because they're not welcome. They don't feel welcome for one reason or another. So I think there's two ways to look at reconciliation in terms of bringing information and public education around Indigenous peoples, around Indigenous cultures, and around the actual history of this country. One is learning about it. And I think we can attack that with programming, with facilities building, with putting cultural markers throughout the city. But learning about still doesn't bring people in. We have lots of places where we can learn about Indigenous peoples, and they're still not feeling welcome. So I propose that we start learning from. That Indigenous peoples have knowledge and experience that we could learn from, that they managed to steward this place for 5,000 years. So if we expect to talk about inclusion, accessibility, reconciliation, ecology, and family-focused learning, that we can look to Indigenous cultures. That inclusion, they have always been welcoming, that they have their own spaces. The reason I chose this image is because this is the Tsleil-Waututh Recreation Center. They have places that they already go. Maybe one of the things that we can do is approach the facilities where they are already going, talk to the leaders of those places and say, what are your challenges? Go to them with our resources and say, how can we complement what you're doing? This is one of the principles that we heard a lot about, was to basically, as a person of settler culture, instead of going to people and saying, how do you fit into what I'm doing? You go to them with your list of resources and say, how do I help you? What are you doing, and how can this help what your goals are? So I think if we go to these places where people are already feeling welcome and they're already getting their recreation needs met, and there are fully fledged communities in the Lower Mainland already serving these needs for these people. So, and we have an enormous amount of resources. How can we work to a place where we're seeing canoe racing games against each other? How do we get to a future where our activities actually complement their activities? Where accessibility is not an issue because they're getting to where they need to go and we are complementing those services. Reconciliation. How do we get to a place where we're starting to learn about the Indigenous peoples, and not in a way that says they were this, they were that, these are the things that happened to them, but things that say, you're here still, and we have some things to learn from you. In terms of being ecologically conscious, they certainly have a lot of knowledge. As I've said, they've successfully stewarded this place for thousands of years. Their perspective on ecology has a lot of alignment with ours, and certainly a lot of alignment with our goals. But they might not agree on everything that all of the methods that we choose. Family focused. We make programming for all kinds of demographics. But the Indigenous communities have always had embedded cross-generational learning. How do we learn from that? How do we learn from a society that has already embedded all of these things? So I invite you to consider the words like inclusion and reconciliation and ecology, and rethink them. Rethink that we are the experts in those things. To rethink pulling everyone into what we want to do. These are our goals. This is what we want to have happen in our recreational spaces, in our public shared spaces. And to say instead, what would you do? How do we share this place together? How do we reconcile the fact that we have Indigenous peoples living next door to us who still have rights and title over this land? How do we live together with them? And I chose this last image because it may be challenging for a lot of reasons, but I think this is a vision of where two cultures can come together. That if we're going to look at something like VanPlay, look at the playbook and where that's headed, that we can start to consider Indigenous values, Indigenous design principles, Indigenous learning, and we can apply that in really beautiful ways. Thank you. Haichkasian.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking all the speakers again. They were fantastic. I know that many of you probably took notes. A number of things stood out to me, and I think that, Rena, you captured it nicely with rethink. I think we have been repositioned, and we should rethink a number of things tonight. But I just quickly, a couple of things that stood out to me is no such thing as a culturally neutral space. I thought that was something that resonated. And I don't know if you caught it, but I figured out that I am resilient because one of the qualities of resilience is to fail gracefully. I think we can all say that we're resilient to some degree. Play with nature. I think it's really important that we remember that throughout this process. Let's hear our youth. Let's hear them. Let's engage them. Let's find them on their space and talk with them. And quite honestly, I think placemaking is pretty easy if you can just let yourself be creative. So laneways are a fun place to be, not necessarily a scary place. So let's rethink. I think that's a good theme for tonight. While I'm up here representing the Park Board, I have to acknowledge that there are three partners who put this on tonight, and it's very important to recognize UBC School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. Urbanarium, and of course the Park Board, where I'm from. We've been filming tonight's proceedings, so hopefully you know you were caught on tape somewhere if you were whispering. And the video will be published on the Urbanarium website shortly, so you can relive the evening and share it with friends. And I can be embarrassed once again with my flubs of the evening, but and we encourage you to share it.